to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. My guest today is Professor Carson. Carson is a professor at the University of Sydney Business School, teaching critical thinking and supervising interns. Carson, as she likes to be known, is a long-time advocate for deliberative mini-publics. She runs masterclasses on dialogue, deliberation and engagement here in Australia, as well as being on the board of the New Democracy Foundation, a non-partisan research and advocacy organisation that promotes the use of deliberative mini-publics to improve democracy. I've invited Carson to open the season on deliberative mini-publics because she is a world-renowned expert in this field, having researched, designed and trained people in how to run deliberative mini-publics for many years now. Welcome, Carson, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Real Democracy Now.
Thanks, Nivek.
All right, so look, before we dive into discussing deliberative mini-publics, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be working in this area?
Yes, I'm almost not sure anymore. It was about 25 years ago, and one's memory does play tricks. But I think I came to this initially when I read a leaflet, a good old leaflet. It doesn't happen anymore. People probably wouldn't pick up a paper leaflet. But it was a little leaflet on a process called demarchy, which was put forward by a philosopher from the University of Sydney. But this particular leaflet was designed by Brian Martin, who went on to become a co-author with me. And it was about a process called demarchy. And his idea was to randomly select people, to put them on committees, and to develop policy. And it seemed like such a novel concept that I was a little intrigued by it. And I went off to read Bernheim's book on Is Democracy Possible? And that stimulated in me a real interest in how you could actually do democracy differently. And I think from that leaflet, I then became interested in how I could support some women to be elected to local government. And almost by accident, I ended up being elected myself. I was just trying to help them become elected and found myself elected. And that gave me a fantastic opportunity to experiment, to practice with some of the principles that I had read originally in that tiny leaflet, which I now realise, of course, were the seeds of deliberative democracy, though in those days we certainly called it community engagement.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yes, deliberative democracy is certainly the current flavour of the month or decade, something like that.
So I agree.
Can we unpack the term deliberative mini-publics? So to start with, what does the word deliberation refer to?
Yes, it's something distinctively different from dialogue or debate. It's not a happy word, is it? People often wrestle with its many syllables, and I rather wish we had a better way of expressing it. But deliberation for me is about shifting from public opinion. We all know what public opinion is about through surveys and polls. Shifting from public opinion to public judgment. And that very term judgment implies that people are weighing options. They're weighing up the strengths and the weaknesses of various options and various arguments. That can only happen if this group of people is deeply informed. It's best if they're a very diverse group, because we're starting to appreciate that the more diverse the group, the better the outcomes, the better the thinking, the richer the thinking, the more fruitful the dialogue or the conversation that precedes this important choice work of weighing up options. And it's definitely about exploring and seeking common ground. So we're trying to establish how much common ground is in the room when you do a deliberation. So instead of focusing on the differences, we're constantly trying to work out what people have in common, what they can agree on, whilst not dismissing the points of disagreement. We can certainly park those and note them, but it's about building common ground. It's also, I guess, an opportunity to create an equal opportunity for people to contribute. So you wouldn't bring people into a deliberative space or a public deliberation without some sort of commitment guarantee that everyone will have a chance to contribute to those discussions, which will ultimately lead to some recommendations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned in that the diversity, and I suppose that really goes to my next question, which is, what is a mini public?
Yes, the diversity is essential because what we're trying to replicate in a mini public is the entire population. So we want to be able to bring people into that mini public that look like the wider population. Now, this can vary. If you've got a tiny mini public that has 12 to 20 people, your chances of getting a perfect match for your population, a perfect demographic match of your population, are trickier than they are if you've got 40 people or 100 people or 350 people in the room. But your aspiration always is to try to reflect the diversity of the entire population. So it's not always possible to say it's a microcosm of a population or a miniature population, but that's definitely the aspiration, to try to get as diverse a group as possible. And it's going to depend upon what it is that they're deliberating on, but at a minimum, you would want to get a mix of people that reflected the entire population in terms of their age, in terms of sex, in terms of probably location, geography, sometimes in terms of education level, because that's a good surrogate for a whole bunch of things. And it will depend. Sometimes you can actually choose them attitudinally, depending upon what it is that you're discussing. But what you're trying to do is to get something which rather resembles a bigger population. Now, if you rely on self-selection, as you would with a public meeting or to some extent a focus group, you're just going to get people who are, I would say, incensed or articulate. Whereas when you randomly select and invite people into this space, you get a very different cohort.
And so, how do you actually go about putting together a mini public that really isn't self-selected or selected by the people who are organising the event to meet their needs?
You have a lottery. So you usually have an independent group or an independent person who undertakes a lottery to get that mix that I just described. In Australia, you might use an electoral roll. You might use, if you were doing something for local government, you might use the addresses that local government has. We have any number of ways of doing this. But the most important thing about this is that everyone should have an equal opportunity to be selected. So by inviting and not just calling for people who are interested, you are much more likely to be able to get that diversity that we spoke about before.
I know I've heard of criticisms where people say these aren't really randomly selected, and I suppose that goes to what people understand about how random selection actually works.
Yes, I think the lottery is actually quite a good analogy for random selection, and maybe the problem is the term selection. I know I've been in public meetings where people have said, but you select them, and there seems to be some confusion about the fact that random selection doesn't necessarily mean that you go off and choose particular people. And I think the other thing that we need to say about the difference between a lottery and the group that we bring into the room is that we typically use a method called stratified random selection. So we might have an initial lottery and have a pool of people in our pool, and then we do a second, again, random selection where we try to meet those demographic criteria that I mentioned before. So you might end up with a pool of 1,000 people who have been randomly selected, and then from that you need to create a profile that matches your population. It sounds much more complicated than it actually is, but it's a difficult thing to describe. And its attribute is that it is incredibly fair and that everyone has an equal opportunity to be selected.
Yes, I haven't heard that. that phrase about the equal opportunity, but I think that's really a nice one to explain how that lottery operates. And would there be, in your view, a particular size of group where if the group you were trying to get together was 1,000 people, you wouldn't need to do the stratification, or would you always think that that was beneficial?
Well, no. I mean, there are some people who do work routinely with 350 people, and they don't believe that stratification is necessary. And in fact, the research that's been done amongst those groups has indicated that they do have a very nice profile of the entire population. And so it's more crucial, the smaller the group, than it is for a large group, definitely.
So look, what is it about deliberative mini-publics that makes them so democratic?
I think because they provide an opportunity for people to govern themselves. The whole nature of democracy is that it should be people governing themselves. We know that the roots of democracy are in random selection in ancient Athens, where it was routine for people to be randomly selected to make incredibly important decisions, including will we go to war, knowing that those people might have to go to war themselves. That what we're trying to do in many ways is use the best of ancient Athens and avoid the worst of ancient Athens, which was not being able to be randomly selected if you're a slave or a foreigner or a woman. But those seeds of democracy were about people coming together routinely and making very important decisions about governance. And I think the beauty of mini publics is that they are trying to achieve just that. It's people coming together, wrestling with complexity sometimes. Incredibly complex topics are often deliberated upon in a way that is something like ancient Athens. And I think it's a beautiful expression of democracy when people can make recommendations that a government actually heeds.
That is nice when that happens, and I think that's one of the challenges always is to get that happening. And that leads nicely into, I suppose it's not so much a question, although partly a question, partly a comment. I was recently reading some work that you'd written with Jeanette Harps-Karp, and in it you identified 3 factors, or criteria you called it, for a fully democratic deliberative process, and they were influence, inclusion, and deliberation. And you noted in that in that paper, or was it a book chapter, that all consultation methods attempt to address these criteria, and the more they're addressed, the more democratic a process is. And I think that sort of, in my mind, links with the point you made earlier about when you first got into this field, it was called community engagement. There wasn't that link with the concept of deliberative democracy. And so I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on what it is that you need to see in a deliberative mini-public process to actually have some strong democratic components.
Yes, well, if I go back to the 3 criteria that Harps-Karp and I have written about, the distinction between community engagement and deliberative democracy becomes very clear. If you think about inclusion, or representativeness was another word that we've often used, when you do community engagement, it's usually self-selection. So people come forward and make comment. But in deliberative democracy, we are randomising and we're inviting people into the space in order to better reflect the community. So there the representativeness is quite different. If I go to the second criterion of deliberation, we talked a little about what deliberation is. So engagement could just be a public meeting, it could be a survey, but deliberation is much more thoughtful, much more informed. The people will actually know a great deal about the topic because they often meet together for quite an extended period. It might be a matter of days. Sometimes those days are over a period of months. Distinctively different from community engagement. And that third criterion of influence is possibly the most important element and the one that is most difficult to achieve. And that is that whatever it is that this group of people in this mini public recommend should have a degree of influence. And that should be very clear from the start. So the decision maker should be prepared to act on the recommendations that come out of these mini publics. Otherwise, yes, you're probably back to engagement. All that's happening is you're hearing opinions from a group of people, but you're not prepared to act on it. So the mini public needs to be sufficiently rigorous and robust for the decision maker to have confidence that what comes out of the mini public is going to be worthwhile implementing. And we're seeing that happen more and more in Australia, and certainly in the work that the New Democracy Foundation is doing. We place great emphasis on the importance of that third criterion of influence. So it's kind of building a mandate for change all the time in a way. It's saying, as a local government, a state government, a federal government, we don't know if we have a mandate to do many, many things. Elections usually have hundreds of policies that are being considered. But if you routinely convene a mini public, you can begin to establish mandates in a range of areas. So I think it's a great way of building confidence in government, avoiding some of the growing mistrust that exists between those who are doing the governing and those who are governed. And as long as you are exercising those three criteria, there's a fair chance that you're going to come up with an outcome that the entire population has confidence in.
And the way you describe deliberative mini publics operating, it sounds like there's a lot, they're very resource intensive, both for the participants in terms of, participating in so many meetings, getting their heads around potentially very complex, areas of public policy, for the organisations convening them in terms of, providing that information, organising the meetings, etc., etc. What sort of issues do they lend themselves to on that basis that they're clearly, it's not a quick survey that you send out and you get a response in, a day or two and just do some quick analysis. It's actually a very detailed, deep engagement process.
Yes, inevitably it's about either complicated or complex issues. New Democracy is currently doing a project on nuclear energy and nuclear storage. We have done a number of projects that could be called participatory budgets to the extent that they are looking at an entire budget of a local government. In other places around the world, there have been mini publics that have been convened on electoral reform. In Australia, we convened the Australian Citizens Parliament to look at how we could govern ourselves better. I've been involved in projects that related to nanotechnology, genetically modified organisms in the food chain, bioethics in New Zealand. They're usually complicated or complex issues, and for the most part, you don't need to put every decision out to a mini public. That would be a very inefficient and wasteful use of taxpayers' money, I think. But there are certainly issues, usually involving values. What services are we prepared to eliminate or reduce? There are value judgments around that, but there are certainly value judgments about GMO or nuclear power that I think lend themselves to a mini public.
And you mentioned about there's mini publics being run here in Australia, and they are very popular here. They're being run around the world. They go by a lot of different names, don't they? I mean, I've heard of consensus conferences, citizens' juries, planning cells. Is it too much to ask for you just to briefly give us an idea about what are the key differences, or is it just people choosing different names?
Yeah, I think it's one of the frustrations of the field that I'm working in is that there are any number of different methods and any number of different names to describe those methods, and some of them are distinctly different. if I think about something, for example, the deliberative poll, which actually contains the word deliberative, so you would think it would be an example of deliberative democracy. And yet, from my point of view, it doesn't go far enough to be classified as that, mostly because it's an incredibly good opinion poll. It actually surveys people as they enter a face-to-face forum, and they hear from speakers and they devise questions for those speakers, and then they complete a survey as they exit that forum. But in a way, they're not doing what happens in a citizens' jury, where they're wrestling together with complexity and exploring common ground and trying to come up with recommendations. And yet there are circumstances in which something like a deliberative poll is just a perfect method for what it is that's trying to be achieved. That's also true of something like a consensus conference, which in the past has been used much more for scientific issues, amongst others. And that's because it emerged in Denmark, and the first ones were convened by the Danish Board of Technology, and because it related to science or technology, it had a different name. It operated in a slightly different way. It had a big emphasis on a steering committee of experts and so on. But I think that's why Jeanette Hartz-Karp and I have come back to this notion of criteria. And for us, it's about what criteria are important in order for us to move towards a more democratic form of decision-making. So from my point of view, I don't care if it's planning cells where there are multiple deliberative forums that are convened in order to come up with a decision, or citizens' juries in the US, which are almost exclusively a small number of people. But in Australia, sometimes we have 35, 40 people in the room. The name to me doesn't matter. It's more, what's the objective? Are you trying to involve people in their own decision-making? And is it achieving that end?
So, Carson, why do you think deliberative mini-publics are so popular now, both here in Australia and around the world?
I think they're gaining popularity because they're overcoming the growing mistrust that I think is emerging between elected representatives and the voters. I think there's not so much in Australia an enormous amount of corruption, but we certainly see that in other countries. I think there's also a sense in which elected representatives are not particularly representative. We've just had an election in Australia, and we can see from those who were elected that they're not in any way resembling the entire population, in that they are mostly men. It's an alarming shortage of women in the new government, for example. And certainly that's true of any kind of cultural or ethnic diversity. And I think people look at that and don't see themselves. And they're, if I'm to use the term, we've gone from hereditary aristocracy to an elected aristocracy, that I think we need to find ways of overcoming that. And I think mini publics are just one way of enabling a wider number of voices to be heard in the whole political landscape. So I think it's a way of overcoming that superficiality of elections, the empty ritual of the vote that we have an opportunity to participate in once every 3-4 years, although in Australia it's sometimes more often than that. I think they're just a good way of building a more democratic landscape. And also, I mentioned before, that notion of building mandates for change. And I think in an increasingly complex world, we need to draw people more and more into that decision-making landscape. Possibly that's why. I think people really do want to have a say in decisions that affect them deeply, and I think we don't provide sufficient opportunities for them to do that, or the opportunities that we have traditionally offered, public meetings being one example, people realise that it's just another form of an empty ritual, that there's a lot of noise, but there's no real influence on the decision making.
My experience is that when there's a call for people to be part of a citizens' jury, there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of interest. However, there's also a certain level of distrust. One of the things I've seen quite a lot, and in my PhD research, some of the people I've interviewed have mentioned to me, is this idea about why are we getting a representative body to do this when we elected our representatives? And so I just wonder what you think about that, because I wonder whether it's that the idea about the role of a citizens' jury isn't being communicated well enough, or whether people, the concept of representative democracy, is viewed differently. You never hear people say that about a public meeting, that why are you having a public meeting, didn't we elect you to get on with it? But when you talk about a deliberative mini-public, that seems to be one of the critiques that comes forward. And I was interested in your view on that.
Well, that's good, because that points out that people can see a difference between a public meeting and a mini-public, that it does actually have a degree of influence, and that's why they're saying, but why do we have influence when we've got elected representatives to do this? I'm surprised to hear you say that you hear that a lot, because when I've interviewed people who have taken up the invitation to participate in a citizens' jury, the most common response I hear is, gee, I was really impressed that I've been given an opportunity to have a real say in something as important as this. This has never happened to me before. I've always thought it was a muscle that is insufficiently used and has become atrophied, this notion of participating in anything that involves policy or politics, because people have become so wary of it for the reasons we've talked about before, that there is growing mistrust in the elected representative. So I haven't heard that so much. I see a surprising willingness by people to have a say, particularly in local issues. We know that people are much more concerned about their own neighbourhood than they are about, their spheres of influence as they go out. They're often less interested. Although, having said that, that's not true. That's not what we're seeing in South Australia at the moment with the nuclear issue. I don't see that. I think people are surprisingly interested in being involved in a citizens' jury. So I wouldn't necessarily hear that complaint from people who take up the invitation. I hear that from the media sometimes, but we have elected representatives. I hear it from elected representatives who will constantly say, but I was elected to govern, why shouldn't I just get on with it? But I don't actually hear that from citizens themselves.
No, and I haven't heard it from people who take up the opportunity to be on a deliberative mini-public. I have heard it when I've looked online at, say, there's been a media coverage of an upcoming citizens' jury, and then there's the comments section. There'll be, a significant number of comments from, one assumes, other people in the community saying, what is this? Didn't we elect the councillors to do this? Why do we need another group? And recently talking to some council staff about processes in their council area, they said that was a bit of flack that they got from people outside of the citizens' juries who were saying, why are you talking to these people? We elected you to do this.
I think we have a very narrow appreciation of what democracy is, and it's back to that atrophied muscle. That's all we've ever known. So we assume that democracy is this very poor cousin of deliberative democracy. We think that representative government, or I might even suggest this oligarchy, is actually what it's all about. And I think it's going to take a lot more mini-publics in order for people to see that there might be opportunities to strengthen our very weak democracy by doing these mini-publics. That, in fact, what we have is is a fairly weak form of democracy. And what we're trying to do is to strengthen that, to make it more robust. So no one is trying to weaken the existing system or undermine it or undercut it. What we're trying to do is to build trust in governance. And I think that's what deliberative democracy does extremely well.
That sort of feeds very much into my next question, which is, what is your view on what is the essence of a real democracy? You've sort of indicated that our current democracy needs to be deepened and that deliberative democracy is a nice way of doing that. What would you see as the essence of a real democracy?
I think it's vital. I think it's energetic. It's certainly self-government. I think it's a way for people to deal responsibly with increasingly complex issues, and that means that we might all have to act like adults and not like children blaming mummy and daddy who happen to be in power at the time. It means that we all have to step up to the plate and, in partnership, wrestle with the complexity of the problems that present themselves to us. So for me, democracy is about self-government, and it has to be done in a way that is sufficiently rigorous that we have faith in it, more faith in it than we have in the existing system. So while there is increasing trust, we're going in the right direction. It's about building trust in political decision making. And however we do that, I'm not at all attached to the sort of methods that I have experimented with and continue to do. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that we have this growing mistrust with the existing system, and I can only see bad outcomes from that. We've been here historically, and I don't want to go there again. I want to create a circumstance in which we are able to govern ourselves and we are able to build that trust that is deteriorating.
That sort of makes me think about the question of what one I was asking recently at a forum I was at is, what would a deliberative democracy look like in practice? So for you, would we really be looking at sort of the current system but with lots more deliberative mini-publics, as you mentioned earlier, on some of these key complex policy issues? Or have you got a view on other structural changes that would be needed?
I think for the moment, any kind of radical change is not going to last. It just never does. You implement a complete change. It happened to me when I was an elected representative in local government. You would implement a change, you'd get the numbers, we'd all be very excited, and then a rescission motion would be moved and it would be undone the following meeting. And I realised that I think I'm an incrementalist, that I know that change has to be slow and it has to be consolidated. And for that reason, I see nothing wrong with a combination of election and sortition, which is just another name for random selection. So I would see a circumstance in which we had any number of mini-publics that were convened around local, state, federal policy making, that in a parliamentary environment that we could have a randomly selected upper house. I think a citizen's senate would be a great way of having oversight of an elected lower house. I would certainly reform the lower house in any country to be more proportional in the way that its representatives reflect the wider population. I would do any number of things around rotation and limited terms and younger voters and so on, but still you could stick with an election model, but combine it with a randomly selected model so that citizens and those who are elected begin to resemble each other in a way. It's just a different method of getting to where we need to go. So combinations appeal to me, and I think that's where we're going. It's just that it's pretty slow. If you think about the number of mini-publics that are convened now, they're very few in relation to how decision-making is typically done. And we certainly don't have a randomly selected upper house, and we've got a very jaundiced lower house as far as I'm concerned. So there are big changes that need to be made. But thankfully, there are a lot of people doing some pretty interesting thinking about this, about different governance systems and so on. And you are clearly one of them by having this series of podcasts.
Thanks so much. So look, the last question I wanted to ask you, and you've almost answered it, although I think I am going to put you on the spot. You've listed a huge range of things that you'd like to see improved in our current system. And I'd like to say to you, if you could change one thing tomorrow about our system of democracy, what would it be?
I'd like Australia to continue to lead the way it started leading the way, with the first women elected to Parliament and up there with the best of them, with the women's right to vote, with the secret ballot and so on. And something terrible happened after that. There wasn't much innovation that occurred. I'd like to see Australia experiment with a citizens' Senate. Federally, I think we have opportunities at a state level to have a randomly selected upper house, so a citizens' Senate in every state. And I'd love to think that we could influence the world by doing that. We influence the world with the secret ballot, which was originally called the Australian ballot. There's no reason why we can't lead the way again. And I think that'd be a real exemplar for others to adopt.
That sounds great. I'd like to see that as well. So based on your incremental approach, we might see it in our lifetimes, but keep our fingers crossed.
I think I have to live an awful lot longer than I'm planning to in order to see it in my lifetime, but maybe I'm being too pessimistic.
All right. Well, I hope you're being pessimistic, and I'm a bit of an optimist, so
Great.
I'd like to think that even one place might do it before you and I can't watch anymore, so we'll see.
Well, there is a bit of activity happening in Belgium at the moment, so it could happen. It could happen in somewhere other than Australia, and I think it might just need for it to happen in one country for others to think, this is actually quite possible. So you could very well be right.
All right, well, let's keep our fingers crossed. So thank you so much for joining us today, Carson. For more information about Carson's work, you can visit the realdemocracynow.com.au website for the show notes for today's episode. The next episode of Real Democracy Now! Continues our season looking at deliberative mini-publics, what they are and why they might make a difference. My second guest is Helene Landemore, an Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University, whose book Democratic Reason looks at the factors behind the superiority of collective decision-making that add up to a strong case for this sort of approach to democracy. I hope you'll join me as we learn more about deliberative mini-publics. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.
What do we want?